Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of July of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Pyatykhatky. This is the western flank of Orekhov bridgehead or Bradley Square. The Ukrainians during the day made at least 5 or 6 attempts, 5 or 6 waves to attack the settlement by the name of Rabotino. The Ukrainians were attacking this settlement mainly from Pyatykhatky. All those attacks were repelled, and currently there is a heavy clashes during the final attack, during the final wave, and the Russians are saying that the number of soldiers that were involved in those attacks was like from 20 soldiers till 200 soldiers. The final wave involved around 200 stormtroopers of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. I don't know what the results we need to expect during this battle, but I believe that after the Battle of Zherebyanki, the Ukrainians will be forced to move 128th Brigade from the combat line because of very heavy losses from their side. Now we're moving further. We're going to talk about the Orekhov bridgehead or Bradley Square. The Ukrainians made also attempts to attack the Russian positions in Rabotino. They were sending more and more forces, but mainly the Ukrainians during the day were making just a few things. The first one is that they continue a process of redeployment of their armored vehicles in infantry closer to the combat line. They are using all possible ways and all possible forest line that can Ukrainians use in this direction. The Russians were spotting this territory, were trying to attack the Ukrainians during that redeployment, but anyway, this, for example, Russian video shows that the Ukrainians did have possibilities, and they did that. They were moving more and more forces to the combat line, and basically the Ukrainians currently are trying to accumulate as much as possible forces on the north of Rabotino, on this area, and as soon as they will be able to create a critical mass on this front line, on this combat line, they will launch their offensive operation to the south among the forest lines, through the fields, and they will try to enter the settlement of Rabotino from the north and to try to dig in as deep as possible in the northern part of the settlement. For now, the Russians were able to repel every single attack, but what is going to be next, nobody knows. Now we are moving further. The Ukrainians, for these purposes, of course, from one side, they are trying to accumulate as much as possible forces on the north of Rabotino. From the other side, the Ukrainians continue their artillery suppression. They're trying to suppress Russian artillery systems, Russian Grad systems, and many other things. For example, the 47th Artillery Brigade, this one, 47th Artillery Brigade, published at least 3 videos of their attacks against Russian positions and against Russian forces. For example, on this video, the 47th Brigade published how they destroyed the Russian Grad using the HIMARS missile. For example, on this video, we see how the Ukrainians of the same 47th Brigade, as a result of artillery attack, destroyed Russian artillery systems that the Russians were trying to hide along the forest line. For example, on this video we can see how the Ukrainians were attacking the same 47th Artillery Brigade was trying to attack and to discover the Russian positions of their infantry and troopers. So we see that from one side the Ukrainians attacking heavily in direction of Pyatykhatky, Bradley Square and Orekhov bridgehead. From the other side we see how the other part of Ukrainian army tried to suppress Russian artillery. The Russians also published during the day a lot of videos how they destroyed Ukrainian artillery systems, but most of them are not geolocated, so that's why it's very difficult to understand whether this is fresh video or old video or where exactly this or that event took place. Of course, they published a lot geolocated, and we will discuss them as well. When talking about Avdiivka tactical bridgehead, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts as usual to attack in direction of Urozhaine and Staromayorska. All those attacks were repelled by the Russian forces. Currently, the Ukrainians continue regrouping. Now, basically, most of the attention, Ukrainian power is moved and concentrated in the vicinity of Klishchiivka, Pyatykhatky, and Orekhov. When talking about Velyka Novoselovka bridgehead, about this area, the Ukrainians continue regrouping, but we expect that in a day or in a two, the Ukrainians will launch their attack on this area as well. As we know, on the 11th and the 12th of July, they're going to be same NATO summit, and the Ukrainians will try to show the result on this bridgehead as well. Very interesting video was published from Novodonetsk from this bridgehead. For example, in this video, we see how the Ukrainians using the French tanks MX-10 were moving along the forest lines, as you can see, and at some second of this movement, one of those tanks were destroyed. And this is a very important video because before that we were showing the Ukrainian progress, Ukrainian control area almost on the north of Novodonetsk. But currently we see that French tank was moved along this forest line, and that tank was destroyed. The Russians haven't provided us the video which type of weapon the Russians were using to destroy that tank. Maybe that was artillery attack, or maybe that was mine, or maybe that was something else. But anyway, we see that the only area where the Ukrainians can feel them safe is very far from the combat line and very far from Novodonetsk. So that's why I have updated this map showing the real area, at least proximate area, that is under Ukrainian control, and the territory between Novodonetsk and this forest line is the combat line, is the area that Ukrainians use to attack in direction of Novodonetsk if they start this attack ever. Now we are moving further to South Donetsk area. Very fierce fightings continue in the vicinity of Vuhledar. Some Russian sources are saying that during the previous days they managed to develop their bridgehead, and mainly the Russians are trying to attack in direction of the residential areas from the south to the north and from Mykolaiv to the east. The Ukrainian controls these industrial and residential, these farms, this industrial area, and Vuhledar itself. For now, we haven't received any updates about the real changes on the map. There was just a note that the Russians managed to develop, but it's very difficult to understand where exactly the Russians managed to develop their attack and the bridgehead. Also, the Russians published one of the episodes of those attacks. This video is not geolocated accurate. It's like maybe this event took place a little bit to the west or to the east, but anyway, we see how the Russians attacked this tank in the fields using some man pots, as you can see in this video. And according to the title and description to this video, this event took place somewhere in the vicinity of Vuhledar. And as you can see later, this tank was just destroyed, probably as a result of attack of man pot. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the total Ukrainian losses from Pyatykhatky to Vuhledar were around 165 soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. As you can see, the level of Ukrainian losses has been reduced in comparison with the previous days. Yesterday, the Ministry of Defense reported about the losses on the level of 300 soldiers, and basically I believe that this situation is connected mainly with the fact that the Russians were forced to step back from the trenches on the north of Rabotino, and that basically the battle of the bridgehead on the north of Rabotino has ended, and currently the forces are doing some kind of regrouping, and they're preparing themselves before the next wave before the next wave of escalation. When talking about the Ukrainians, currently they're trying to dig in as deep as possible in this area, and as soon as they're able to dig deeper, they will launch their attack. The Ukrainians need to be sure that if their attack are failed by the Russians, then they need to be for sure that as a result of counteroffensive, the Russians won't be able to return these positions. So this is the only thing that Ukrainians want to achieve, and this is the only reason of a small operational pause, at least on this front line. Now we are moving to Avdiivka. The situation is very interesting on this bridgehead. The Ukrainians during the previous days made attacks in direction of Krasnogorovka and in direction of Vysyola, but those were not the real offensives when the Ukrainians were trying to restore control over the settlements. Basically, the Ukrainians were trying to do the same thing as the Russians are doing all the time before the enemy's counteroffensive. The Russians attacks, trying to establish control over the edge enemy's positions, and as soon as enemy attacks, the Russians very slowly retreat step by step, but they're retreating, let's say, on the enemy's positions, but not on their own. So basically the Ukrainians did the same. They got as close as possible to Krasnogorovka and Vesele because they understand that very soon the Russians are going to launch another wave of attack exactly on the eastern flank of Avdiivka. So the Russians are planning to attack all over this red line. And their main purpose is to get as close as possible to settlement. Of course, the strategical goal is to enter Avdiivka itself. If they are not able to do this as a result of one attack, then they need to capture at least the edge Ukrainian positions. For example, today we got another video how the Russians using the flamethrower systems were bombing Ukrainian positions. Basically, this is some kind of artillery preparation, and they're trying to destroy the Ukrainian infantry, the Ukrainian reserves, and after few days of such attacks, the Russians will obviously attack. And the Ukrainians understand this well, and this is the reason why we see such intensifying of bombing using Storm Shadow missiles, the small settlement that located in Donetsk agglomeration by the name of Makeivka. The second day in a row, the sources published the video how the Ukrainians bombing and shelling and destroying Russian ammo depots. This is the second ammo depot that was destroyed in Makeivka, and basically the Russians were planning to use this ammo depot to supply and support offensive forces on the eastern flank of Avdiivka for the Russian forces. But we see that not everything is going to be so easy. Now we are moving to Klishchiivka, the area of the most fierce clashes. We got a lot of videos, a lot of updates from this bridgehead during the previous 24 hours, so let's discuss them step by step. First of all, we need to understand the real positions of the forces, and for these purposes, let's discuss a little bit map and a little bit videos that we got. The Ukrainians continue their attacks without any operational pause, without any pause at all, and mainly they are using the road from Ivanovska to the south. This is the main road of the Ukrainians' attacks. From Ivanovska, a little bit on the eastern road in direction of the forest, and then in direction of the Russian northern trenches. And the Russians, for example, published the video of movements of the Ukrainian forces who were heading from Ivanovska to the south. As you can see on this video, the Ukrainians are not using armored vehicles or personal armored carriers for movement and redeployment the reserves. Mainly the Ukrainians base their attacks on, let's say, on soldiers' feet. They allow them to move like step by step. Maybe the Ukrainians analyzed and understood that using armored vehicles is not a very good idea for offensive operation, because armored vehicles is the best target for the Russian forces. That was the video of movements, let's say, on the eastern road. Also, there was a video of the movements on the western road, on this one, when the Ukrainians were trying to move to the south, and one of the armored vehicles, Ukrainian armored vehicle, was destroyed during that process. So basically, from one side, it shows the Ukrainians waves, endless waves, with very small platoons from 10 to 20 soldiers that endlessly were moving to the south. And from the other side, this video confirms at least that the Ukrainians still haven't entered the western edge, western fortification. I'm talking about this fortification for now. So the Ukrainians still haven't entered, at least in this area. But today we got for the first time the first confirmation that as a result of fierce fightings and something like this, the Ukrainians managed to enter this fortification area, these Ukrainian armored vehicles. So basically this video is a fact, and this fact tell us that the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the Russians' defense belt and to enter these fortifications using personal armored carrier or maybe some kind of armored vehicle. We don't know the destiny of those soldiers of that armored vehicle. Maybe the Ukrainians were forced to step back. After that, we haven't received more updates. But anyway, this is the first fact saying that Ukrainians got as close as possible to Klishchiivka itself. So for now, we won't add any black lines saying about this fortification, because for now, maybe this area is already under Ukrainian control. Very interesting updates are coming from the southern flank. From these territories, you can see I have added the flag, Ukrainian control. Why is that? The first is that we got another video from the, let's say, area in the vicinity of the forest, and this video is geolocated. It's very difficult to understand what you see on this video, but I will stop on the important moment. As you can see, there was a tank, and the Ukrainians attacked the tank using javelin. You see this this the shadow of the missile attack of javelin. And basically, if we try to make there is a very big angle of that attack, and basically if we will try to analyze the area that Ukrainians were using to attack, basically, and probably the Ukrainians were attacking somewhere from this direction. The distance between the tank that was attacked by the Ukrainians is around 2 kilometers, and this is normal distance for javelins, and probably the Ukrainians were attacking somewhere from this direction. So according to this geolocation and just our small speculations, probably the Ukrainians managed to establish control over these forest lines and over this territory. This is not very good piece of news for the Russians, because basically the Ukrainians have cut the Russian forces that located in Klishchiivka and Avdiivka. And this is the first bad piece of news for the Russians. The second one is that currently the Russians can use just few supply roads to supply and support their forces in Klishchiivka. This is the first supply road. This is the second supply road, and basically this is the third supply road that the Russians can use to supply and support their forces inside of this fortification. And if the Ukrainians were able to capture this forest line, and the video with attack using javelin at least give us these things, this idea to think about, we understand that Ukrainians have already established, let's say, fire control over the first supply road as well, over this territory as well. The distance is around 1.78 kilometers, and basically this is a very good distance, and not very good distance, this is a normal distance to attack using javelins and every type of artillery. So basically the Ukrainians have already at least established fire control over one of the supply roads that moves in direction of Klishchiivka. There are still no operational encirclement, of course, but the situation is very critical and very close to the operational encirclement. When talking about the southern flank, the Russians control this territory, at least for now, these forest lines between Avdiivka and the Ukrainian positions. There was a video of that. The Ukrainians using drone attack Russian armored vehicle that were moving along this road. So basically it confirms that the southern flank in the vicinity of Avdiivka, at least by this morning, was and maybe still is under Russian control. Very terrible and very scary video we got from somewhere from Artemovsk. I have added this icon softly. This is Russian soldier. And on this video, he was talking that during the battle of Klishchiivka, during the recent battle in the vicinity of Artemovsk, the Ukrainians started using chemical weapon. Maybe it's media victory, maybe it's media campaign, maybe it's media action from the Ukrainian side, and they're trying to break the Russian spirit. Who knows? Few days ago, there was a video and a report from the Ukrainian side that the Russians were using chemical weapon, but on Orekhov front line. I'm not sure whether the Russians or the Ukrainians started using the chemical weapon, but I know for sure that probably they will do this, and they're going to do this very soon, and they're going to do this massively. And not because they don't care, but for example, today we got updates from the United States of America that they're going to start supplying Ukraine the cluster bombs, and this is terrible weapon that could lead to real military crimes from Ukraine side. This chemical weapon, this is the second update during these days, and many other things tells that the parties are going to intensify the conflict and are going to use more and more dangerous weapons from both sides. Don't forget about challengers with uranium depleted munitions. So the game is going to become more difficult and harder for both sides. Also, the Ukrainians continue suppressing the Russian artillery systems and Russian ammo depots and positions in their back, trying not to allow the Russians to be flexible and mobile. For example, today they got another video how the Ukrainians, using the forces of 54th, I believe, artillery brigade, destroyed one Russian tank in the vicinity of Zaitseva, and in the vicinity of this area, the Ukrainian forces of 24th Mechanized Brigade destroyed one ammo depot. Basically, the 5th Brigade, 5th Assault Brigade, and 3rd Assault Brigade are storming these positions in Klishchiivka for 3 days in a row. I expect that sooner or later they will be forced to slow down, and after that they will be replaced by 28th Mechanized Brigade and 24th. These two brigades are going to attack, of course, somewhere from the south in direction of Kurdyumovka, and also further move in direction of Adradovka and Andreevka. Also, the Russians published a video how they were trying to make their own artillery duels, and today they reported they destroyed the ammo depot of 108th Territory Defense Brigade. This brigade. The main purpose of this brigade is to hold the territories that can be captured by 3rd Assault or 5th Assault or 28th Mechanized. So the Russians understand what tactics the Ukrainians use and try to reduce the Ukrainian plans as much as possible. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings from Donetsk to, let's say, Siversk bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 385 soldiers, 12 armored vehicles and 1 tank. This is very heavy losses, heavier than yesterday and heavier than the day before yesterday, so we can say that this is the heaviest losses since the beginning of this week. Now we are moving to the northern flank to this territory. There was also just a few videos like how the Ukrainians tried to work and operate on this flank. The Ukrainians attacked one Russian positions where the Russian forces were hiding, and the Ukrainians published the video how 10th Mountain Assault Brigade were bombing and shelling the Russian positions in the vicinity of Bilogorovka. This is a very useful video because it was very difficult, at least for me, to understand where exactly the front line, the combat line goes, at least on this part of the front line. And currently I see, and I have adjusted the map because the Ukrainians were bombing these positions. So basically these railroad ways, at least the forest line along the railroad ways, at least in this part of the railroad ways, is under Russian control. Also, the Russians reported that they bombed and destroyed the ammo depot of 10th Brigade in the vicinity of Velyka, and the Russians destroyed another ammo depot of 4th Brigade that was recently redeployed in direction of Bilogorovka, 4th Rapid Response Brigade Rubish of National Guard. When talking about Lyman Frontline, the Ukrainians and the Russians currently is in defense state. They're trying to repel the Ukrainians' attacks. The Ukrainians almost every single day send more and more waves of commando squads. They're not using the broad frontline attacks as we can see in Klishchiivka and Bradley Square. Mainly the Ukrainians try to operate using just commandos. And during the previous days, the Ukraine lost 90 soldiers and 7 armored vehicles. Also, we got the first video confirmation how the Russians, as a result of artillery attack, managed to destroy Ukrainian CV-90 armored vehicles. This is Swedish armored vehicle, and some sources are saying that probably this is the best armored vehicle that currently the Ukrainians, type of armored vehicles that currently the Ukrainians have in their army. And now we're coming to the third most interesting part of the front line, starting from Kupiansk to Kharkiv area. We got a lot of updates. We start receiving significant number of updates from this bridgehead, particularly from Kharkiv area. But before that, let's discuss a little bit Kupiansk front line. As we discussed, the Russians launched a small attacks in direction of Novoselovska, and the main purpose of those attacks, the Russians are not going to use very deep strikes. They're not planning to in a day or two to capture or to get Oskol River. They're going to be very careful. They're going to attack very slowly, step by step, and the purpose of those attacks is to feel and to understand the level of defense and the level of power of Ukrainian forces on this bridgehead. Currently, and the only thing that the Russians knows for sure is that during the battle of south area of Orekhov, Vremivka tactical bridgehead, during the battle of Klishchiivka, the Ukrainians have lost significant number of armored vehicles that haven't been replaced by the Western countries. We haven't seen any big aid announcement from the Western countries about supplying Ukraine with more Challengers or Leopards and so on. So the Russians understand that Ukrainians don't have a lot of armored vehicles. They're not attacking massively because from the other side they understand that they need to be very careful. But believe me, as I understand that the Russians will increase the pressure, at least in this area, trying to figure out whether the Ukrainians are able to stop the Russians or not. And if the Russians at some point understand that Ukrainians don't have forces to stop the Russians in Kupiansk front line, we are going to see massive attack in direction of Oskol River. But this is not the situation of 1 day or 2 days. It can take even months, and furthermore it can never happen because the Ukrainians, as soon as they understand the value and the problem on this front line, will redeploy some forces to stop the Russians' advances. And today the Russians also published the video, the Ukrainians, my bad, how they were attacking, how they were making support offensive operation, trying to block Berestove, and while the Russians were blocking Berestove from the north, the main forces managed to enter Novosilovskaya and almost completely cleared that settlement. And after successful operation, the Russian forces were retreating towards their main land and their main position. And the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, at least on this bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. And now we are moving to Kharkiv area. As you can see, there are a lot of icons. The Russians, probably the 4th or 5th day in a row, continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in this area. And basically, maybe I am the first channel who has already stated this, but as I see, according to my own analysis, I see that the Russians have already started making the buffer zone in Kharkiv area. And I will provide you my which facts I used to make such a conclusion. But before that, the Russians published the video how they were bombing the Ukrainian positions in Petroivanovka. This settlement is located on the north of Dvorichne, and as a result of that attack, the Russians destroyed another ammo depot, Ukrainian positions, and this is some kind of artillery suppression before upcoming Russian offensive operation on this bank of Oskol River in direction of Dvorichne. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainians along the Belgorod border. This is the area where the Ukrainians were trying to cross the area, tried to attack Novotavlazhanka during the May and June. There was a lot of videos from this territory. The Russians bombed Ukrainian troops in the vicinity a little bit to the east of the main bridgehead. They managed to discover Ukrainian positions, and using Krasnopol shell, they accurately destroyed that position. Furthermore, there was a video how the Russians destroyed another ammo depot on this bridgehead. Mainly for these purposes, the Russians were using Krasnopol artillery shell. All of these videos, all of these strikes were made by Russian accurate shell Krasnopol. And the last video from this area when the Russians destroyed the Ukrainian fuel depot that Ukrainians probably were using or still use to supply and support their forces along the border. And now we're going to the most important video. Today the Russians also published how they attacked the Ukrainian positions in the small settlement along the border by the name of Kazachye Lopan. The difference between those attacks, the Russian attacks, and this one is that in this area, the Russians were using Krasnopol shell, it's artillery shell, and when talking about this area, the Russians were using tanks. So just take a look at this area. There is ammo depots, there is a Russian tank that were somewhere in the vicinity of this area, and as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to hit some barracks and maybe they destroyed Ukrainian positions. We haven't received any numbers about the losses, but the thing is that this video is geolocated, and basically the Russians were attacking these farms or maybe industrial area, and that attack was made by T-72, the Russian tank. And if we try to calculate the distance between this area and let's say this forest, the possible area that the Russians were using to attack, the distance is 202 kilometers and 780 meters. So as you can see, the Russians couldn't attack this territory from the Russian territory because the distance would be too big. So basically the Russians, if they attacked this settlement with tanks, they needed to be closer, and the most important, they needed to be on the territory of Ukraine. So basically, according to these facts that we have just discussed, I understand that the Russians have already crossed the border and have already captured and established small buffer zone on the border with Belgorod. So as I understand, this territory is already under Russian control. There are no Ukrainians, and civilians as well. Most of them retreated from the combo, from the border, and currently this territory is already under Russians. Now we see that the Russians are bombing this territory of Ovchansk, and probably we're going to see the Russian movements in this area as well. Furthermore, the governor of Belgorod reported that after these local authorities have created territory defense brigade with 3,000 troopers, they start the process of making another brigade with another 3,000 troopers. So in a month, there are going to be 6,000 soldiers that can be involved in the operation of creation the buffer zone between Belgorod and Kharkiv. Furthermore, today some sources were saying that Prigozhin left territory of Belarus, and today he was in Rostov-on-Don. As we know, this is the main command center of Russian army of special military operation. There was a meeting, and no matter the strikes and fights in the past between the head of Wagner and Ministry of Defense, they had a meeting, they talked, they discussed something. After that, some sources were saying that Prigozhin moved to Moscow, and there was another meeting with the president of Russian Federation, I believe so. And all these things, all these facts are saying us that probably very soon Prigozhin with his army will be redeployed in the vicinity of Belgorod, and the Russians will use the tactics of that the storming troopers of Wagner's will capture the settlements, and the territory defense will hold this territory while Wagner are pushing further. And as we remember, the sources were saying that Wagner's are going to return on the 5th of August, and there is less than 1 month left before that date. And of course, Wagner's will start earlier. At least we will see the satellite pictures of accumulation of their forces along the border, and we need to start seeing them very soon, maybe in a week or maybe in 2. Another interesting update we received from the special military operation. Today the Russians published the video how they managed to capture and to get almost and not damaged Storm Shadow missile. Currently the Russians, as you can see, this Storm Shadow is almost without any damage, and the Russians have already redeployed this missile to the territory of Russian Federation. They're going to give this missile to the engineers that will split this missile into parts, and of course the Russians will improve their weapon and they're going to make them better. At least as we know, Storm Shadow missile, according to specification, is like a missile that is invisible for air defense systems. But now I believe that the Russians will get possibilities to start see these missiles in the world. Also, we need to discuss just a few things about Lvov. During the previous night, the Russians made massive missile attack, and this is the most probably western settlement on the territory of Ukraine. And as a result of that attack, the Russians, as you can see in this video, managed to destroy one building on the left and some industrial building on the right side of this screen. Some sources are saying that as a result of those attacks, the Russians managed to bury under the ruins around 800 Ukrainian soldiers, and also as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to destroy the ammo depot or warehouse of United Kingdom tanks Challengers with its munitions. As you can see, the building is almost ruined, just the walls left. I'm not sure that anything can survive after such attack from the Russian side. Very interesting numbers, the final part, very interesting numbers are coming from Kherson area. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of artillery strikes upon the territory, upon the bridgehead of Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Antonov Bridge, and probably upon the force that located on the Ukrainian side of the river, the Ukrainians lost 130 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. This is the heaviest losses of the Ukrainians, probably even since the creation of this front line along the Dnipro River. So on the 11th and 12th of July, we're going to see the NATO summit. We're going to see more events during the next few days. I hope that nothing terrible is going to happen. And mainly, of course, I'm talking about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. because we discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians were based their logic and their words about the Russians mined the power plant because of these blue white things on the roof, saying the Ukrainians were saying that that was the explosion. So we'll see, but I hope that nothing terrible is going to happen with Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.